In 1648, the 80-year war between Catholic Spain and the rebellious Dutch Protestant provinces ended with the Treaty of Westphalia's recognition of an independent Dutch republic and of its Calvinist religion. The Netherlands, and notice this country goes by a lot of names, emerged as a vital new political, economic, and cultural force. The Calvinist Protestants had no objection to lending money at interest, and Amsterdam replaced Florence as Europe's banking center. The Dutch East India Company dominated trade in the Indies and controlled much of the worldwide shipping that was bringing Europe new prosperity. Religious toleration attracted immigrants, including America's future pilgrims, and they further contributed to Dutch wealth. On this map, the striped areas are the Dutch Republic. The pale areas, harder to see, are Flanders, or the portion of the Low Countries still Catholic and still controlled by Spain. Recall that's where Rubens painted. At a time when most Europeans worked in agriculture, over half the population of the Dutch Republic lived in towns of more than 30,000 people. This urban middle class had an insatiable appetite for painting. Art historians estimate that between 5 and 10 million Dutch works of art were produced in the 17th century. Very few of these, perhaps fewer than 1%, have survived. So here's a detail from a Dutch painting that shows a painter selling his paintings on the street. Amsterdam was not only Europe's financial center, it was the center of Europe's art market. So the great works of the Italian and Flemish Baroque artists frequently passed through Amsterdam, and Dutch painters took notice. This is getting ahead of our story. We have a few painters to see before we can linger on my favorite Rembrandt. But I'm turning to Simon Schama and his Power of Art series again, this time on Rembrandt, for an introduction to the culture of Amsterdam. And if we begin to learn about Rembrandt portraits, so much the better. You should note, Rembrandt's portraits are very distinctive and very, very important to the history of art. So take notes about the Rembrandt elements of this portrait, okay? Well, sure, he was a Catholic, and sure, he was a little crazy, in fact, a homicidal maniac, but the tolerant and art-obsessed Dutch embraced Caravaggio anyway, especially his contrasts of light and dark, and his portrayal of ordinary people caught up in extraordinary events. So here is a Caravaggio wannabe Dutch version of The Calling of Matthew. What similarities and differences do you see? Let's quickly flash Caravaggio again, then come back to this painting. So again, what similarities and differences do you see? Well, in both, Christ is deliberately obscured. In both, Matthew is astonished to be pointed out. But in the Dutch version, there's less chiaroscuro. The color gradation is more gradual. And notice there's more focus on Matthew as a tax collector, on counting money. That was, after all, a Dutch specialty. So we see somewhat more chiaroscuro in this genre painting. You remember what a genre painting is, right? And the influence of Caravaggio is again obvious. The subject matter here is not biblical, but it is, and this is very typical of the Dutch Baroque, it is moralistic. So on the right, we see a man succumbing to gluttony, one of the deadly sins. Above him, in the spotlight, we see a young prostitute and her aged procuress, that's a female pimp. Seated next to them is a man holding that well-known symbol of sexual impropriety, the lute. See, you do learn something in art history. But what this rising Dutch middle class really gobbled up was portraits, and especially portraits of themselves. The golden age of Dutch painting was also the golden age of portraiture, and one of its masters was Frans Hals. Now, I'm a little surprised that the Laughing Cavalier does not appear in your textbook, since it's probably Hals's most famous painting. Hals is especially admired for his ability to capture human expression. You'll note that his vision of human nature is rather cheerier than Caravaggio's. He is also noted for his light, loose brushstroke. Remember Velázquez's Princess's Dress? And this helped give his paintings a sense of spontaneity. So here's another favorite that's not in your book. By the way, Frans Hals shows up in a lot of AP test questions, so you do need to know this artist, and he's very distinctive. The last couple of portraits gave Hals a chance to show off his exquisite rendering of textiles, but those Dutch Calvinists presented a challenge to portraitists. They dressed pretty much in undifferentiated and unrelieved black, except for those stark white collars, which were also tricky to paint. The Dutch demand for group portraits also posed a compositional challenge for artists. So how do you cram all those people into a painting and still make the painting interesting? Hals accomplishes this above all by giving each face an individual expression. He also uses intriguing diagonals in his portrait of the archers of St. Hadrian. Look at those spears, for example. And he uses a murky, mysterious landscape to liven up his group portrait of the women regents. But then, along comes Rembrandt, and the group portrait will never be the same again. Note, we still have the dark, undifferentiated clothing, and the artist still faces the challenge of cramming a lot of people into a painting. Still, this work represents something of a breakthrough. The light is much more dramatic. Note the tenebrism. Rembrandt, along with Caravaggio, is the great tenebrist in art history. The faces are even more differentiated and show more psychological insight. In fact, the Dutch were above all psychological painters. You look at these portraits and you feel like you're staring into the personality of these individuals. Again, light is used more dramatically with homage to our buddy, yes, Caravaggio. And note that this was painted when Rembrandt was just 26. He gets better. Okay, fast forward a decade, and Rembrandt produces this masterpiece, one of the most famous paintings in art history, and therefore one, as you might suspect, is going to show up on your AP Art History test. I'm now going to return to the Simon Schama video for a longer look at this painting and, interestingly, the harm that it did to Rembrandt's career. I've mentioned that the Dutch Calvinists refused to put art into churches, but this does not mean that they opposed paintings of biblical scenes or refused to hang them in their homes or other public spaces that weren't churches. Rembrandt's Old and New Testament scenes are, in fact, among his most moving works. Note that in his later paintings, Rembrandt's style becomes rougher, with looser brushstrokes and somewhat more abstract depiction of his subjects. His colors become a little brighter and his brushstrokes more pronounced. Interestingly, he was moving in the opposite direction from many of his Dutch contemporaries. As we'll see in a few minutes, Dutch painting was becoming increasingly detailed, with small, fine brushstrokes and sharper lines. In fact, contemporaries of Rembrandt often accused his later paintings of coarseness. I think we appreciate them partly because we look forward to the Impressionists and beyond them to more modern, abstract painting. Rembrandt, in many important ways, leads the way. So we don't actually know a lot about Rembrandt's religion. He does not appear on any church rolls. We do know that his father was a Dutch Calvinist and his mother was a Roman Catholic. There's also some evidence that he strongly supported religious toleration. In this portrait, a very interesting self-portrait, again, for an essay, he portrays himself as the Apostle Paul with the letter to the Corinthians, a letter that devotes considerable space to deploring disputes among Christians. Rembrandt painted more than 90 self-portraits. Like Albrecht Dürer, he seemed to enjoy tracking his own face through his lifetime, and he's pretty unrelenting in looking at himself in old age. Both of these portraits display the softer, looser brushstroke style, but the later portrait is even more abstract. Note that while Rembrandt is a master of chiaroscuro, like Velázquez, he likes to show rather more gradations of light. Rembrandt was also the master of the art of etching. Etchings are made by covering a plate of metal with wax, incising the drawing into the wax, and then pouring in acid that etches through the metal plate. Soft wax is easier to carve and allows for diversity of shading and depth, as you see in this picture of Christ receiving the children. This, by the way, again, is the kind of religious art that pious Calvinists would hang in their homes, and again, not in their churches. The next generation of Dutch patrons wants more refined paintings. They are getting richer. They're traveling to France and Italy and Spain. They're moving a little bit away from their Calvinist roots and longing to be more like the Italians, the French, those stylish Baroque. Rembrandt moves in the opposite direction. Again, as I mentioned earlier, his paintings become rougher and darker. Here is still another self-portrait and a portrait of his mistress. Let's watch one last clip, which you'll discover soon is that Rembrandt is in many ways anticipating directions that art will take 2 centuries later. The Dutch tolerance extended to women artists, and Judith Leister, who, by the way, is a big College Board favorite, had a successful career as a portraitist. Notice the portrait. In the portrait, she depicts herself painting and painting skillfully. This is an advertisement. As for the painting itself, does it remind you of another artist we've just looked at? I would say it looks like Frans Hals, and she is often compared, including by the College Board, to Frans Hals. Note the loose brushstrokes on the dress, and of course in the painting that she's painting. This painting does not appear in your textbook, but it does appear in the AP test with the artist identified. This is a genre painting. We don't know who this woman is, so it's not really a portrait. And it's probably another moralistic work. And why do I say that? What do we see happening? What seems to be happening in this painting? And by the way, art historians debate about that. The one thing that does seem pretty clear is that he's older than she is and he's handing her money. She, however, doesn't really appear to be wanting anything to do with him. You're going to hear from one of your classmates about this painting. You'll also see a resemblance to Vermeer, the painter with whom I'm planning to end this lecture. But first, moralistic genre paintings take a more humorous, even satiric tone with the paintings of Jan Steen. I especially like The Little Boy Weeping because he only got a birch switch from St. Nicholas. Steen's paintings are lively, even raucous. They're most likely to show up as an example of genre painting. Steen liked to use children to make points about adult behavior. This painting also isn't in your textbook, but what point do you think the artist is trying to make here? Actually, I don't really know, but maybe these children are engaged as so many adults are engaged in fruitless endeavors. Cats have many talents, but dancing is not among them. Love that dog, by the way. Even though Dutch culture was predominantly urban, their long struggle to reclaim their land from the sea gave the Dutch great attachment to their actually rather flat and sometimes even boring countryside. No loose brushstrokes here. Dutch landscape painters tend to pay exquisite attention to detail, and especially the play of light through the clouds and on the land. Clouds are very big in Dutch landscape painting, and they're superbly portrayed. Note how people, buildings, and countryside are all harmoniously integrated. This, too, was part of the Dutch vision. This is a peaceful, tamed countryside. By the way, Van Ruysdael is an artist you should remember by name and his association with landscape paintings. Hint, hint. Here are a couple more examples of Dutch landscape painting, and I'm not even going to bother to identify the painters. Just to give you a feel for 17th century Dutch landscape painting, you'd be more likely to be asked to recognize where these are from. Winter scenes were popular with the Dutch. Think of Bruegel's Hunters in the Snow or the Census of Bethlehem. Another typically Dutch Baroque genre was still life painting. These were very popular with urban middle-class customers who wanted to show off their good stuff, and they also gave painters an opportunity to show off their ability to paint reflected light, to paint transparent objects, to capture the look and feel of rich textiles. This painting, again, as I just said, also shows off the wealth and widespread trading connections of the urban middle class. Even back then, Ming vases from China were mighty pricey. Flower paintings were another very specific, very popular genre that shows off an artist's technical skill. Note again, the brushwork is tight and precise. It's really almost invisible. Notice, too, that the work is very carefully composed with a strong diagonal. This may be a still painting, but nevertheless has a great deal of dynamism. This is a so-called Vanitas still life, and this is a genre you need to be able to recognize, and you can almost always find them because somewhere in a Vanitas painting there is usually a picture of a skull or some other indication of death. A Vanitas still life combines the customer's taste for luxury goods, the artist's mastery of realism, and the much beloved Dutch moral message. That message, and you need to know this word, is the transience of life. So what does transience mean? Well, note the skull, the ticking timepiece, the overturned glass. Life is fleeting, so make the most of your time. Note the artist's self-portrait mirror in the ball. This is a master at work, and this is somebody who knows his Velázquez and his Jan van Eyck. Note again the tight brushwork and superb rendering of the surfaces and materials. The traditions of the Northern Renaissance very much live on in Dutch still life and Vanitas paintings. Okay, we're going to end with one of Holland's most beloved painters, and recently one of art history's more controversial painters. The controversy stems from speculation that he produced these exquisitely detailed paintings by cheating, kind of, and using a camera obscura to copy his images. By the way, there's an interesting documentary entitled Tim's Vermeer that explores this issue. And of course, it was discussed in the Khan Academy video that you all watched, right? Vermeer is a master of the play of light and shadow in domestic Dutch interiors. Whether he cheated or not, his mastery of details, especially surfaces, is extraordinary, as are the expressions and moods he catches with light. We know this is a love letter because of there's the lute again. In fact, again, this suggests it's probably illicit love. And because we see paintings behind her of a ship sailing away and a man walking down a path, which are actually symbols of abandonment. Vermeer tells a lot of stories in his paintings, and they're fun to unpack. Well, I love this painting, so I wanted to throw it in. Note the loose brushstrokes, the chiaroscuro, and above all, the highly evocative psychological portraiture. One of your class essay presentations will talk about Vermeer and how a painting could be attributed to Vermeer. Okay, we've already seen one Baroque painting about painting. And which work am I referring to? Las Meninas by Velázquez. Now Vermeer takes up the subject. I hope you did watch the Khan Academy video about this work, which I could really see paired with Las Meninas in an image-based question. Remember, I think Las Meninas is overdue to show up in your image-based questions. Well, I'm going to close this lecture in this unit with the opening segment of a video about Vermeer. The narrator is Meryl Streep, though you hear from some art historians as well. But what I really like is that in this 5 minutes, you see lots and lots of Vermeers. Lucky you. I suspect you are all more than overdosed on art videos at this point, but I still would like to recommend the entire video. It is one of the best videos I've seen for discussing technique, the use of light, the use of color, the use of perspective, the use of shading, and how all of these techniques are used to get the artist's point across. It also talks about the complex meaning in these paintings, which is fun to know. In other words, this video models a first-rate AP art history essay and might give you some good material for an essay. So if it isn't something that appeals to you now, maybe the weeks before the test, you have a little time to free it up in the next few days as you move into Unit 10. But before you watch this last clip, or for that matter, think about Unit 10, I do want to issue a warning. This is a tough test, and I'm not giving out quite as many answers in my test review. I'm making you work for some of these. You're going to need to spend some time preparing your presentations, listening carefully to each other, and studying these works. This is an extraordinarily rich and varied art historical period, and it's one you need to know. Just remember, you're about to get a break.